Chapter 19, Part 1 of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, Part 1. The night passed. The gloom turned gray. The dawn stole cool and pale into the canyon. When Nas Ta Bega drove the mustangs into camp, the lofty ramparts of the walls were rimmed with gold, and the dark arch of Nonnezoshe began to lose its steely gray. The women had rested well and were in better condition to travel. Jane was cheerful and Fay radiant one moment and in a dream the next. She was beginning to live in that wonderful future. They talked more than usual at breakfast, and Lassiter made droll remarks. Shefford, with his great and haunting trouble ended forever, with now only danger to face ahead, was a different man, but thoughtful and quiet. This morning the Indian leisurely made preparations for the start. For all the concern he showed, he might have known every foot of the cañon below Nonnezoshe. But for Shefford, with the dawn had returned anxiety, a restless feeling of the need of hurry. What obstacles, what impassable gorges might lie between this bridge and the river? The Indian's inscrutable serenity and Fay's trust, her radiance, the exquisite glow upon her face, sustained Shefford and gave him patience to endure and conceal his dread. At length the flight was resumed, with Nas Ta Bega leading on foot and Shefford walking in the rear. A quarter of a mile below camp, the Indian led down a declivity into the bottom of the narrow gorge, where the stream ran. He did not gaze backward for a last glance at Nonnezoshe, nor did Jane or Lassiter. Fay, however, checked Nack Yal at the rim of the descent and turned to look behind. Shefford contrasted her tremulous smile, her half-happy good-bye to this place, with the white stillness of her face when she had bade farewell to Surprise Valley. Then she rode Nack Yal down into the gorge. Shefford knew that this would be his last look at the Rainbow Bridge. As he gazed, the tip of the great arch lost its cold, dark stone color and began to shine. The sun had just arisen high enough over some low break in the wall to reach the bridge. Shefford watched. Slowly, in wondrous transformation, the gold and blue and rose and pink and purple blended their hues, softly, mistily, cloudily, until once again the arch was a rainbow. Ages before life had evolved upon the earth, it had spread its grand arch from wall to wall, black and mystic at night, transparent and rosy in the sunrise. At sunset, a flaming curve limned against the heavens. When the race of man had passed, it would, perhaps, stand there still. It was not for many eyes to see. Only by toil, sweat, endurance, blood, could any man ever look at Nonnezoshe. So it would always be alone, grand, silent, beautiful, unintelligible. Shefford bade Nonnezoshe a mute, reverent farewell. Then, plunging down the weathered slope of the gorge to the stream below, he hurried forward to join the others. They had progressed much farther than he imagined they would have, and this was owing to the fact that the floor of the gorge afforded easy travel. It was gravel on rock bottom, tortuous but open, with infrequent and shallow downward steps. The stream did not now rush and boil along and tumbled over rock-encumbered ledges. In corners the water collected in round, green, eddying pools. There were patches of grass and willows and mounds of moss. Shefford's surprise equaled his relief, for he believed that the violent descent of Nonnezoshe Boco had been passed. Any turn now, he imagined, might bring the party out upon the river. When he caught up with them, he imparted this conviction which was received with cheer. The hopes of all except the Indian seemed mounting, and if he ever hoped or despaired, it was never manifest. Shefford's anticipation, however, was not soon realized. The fugitives traveled miles farther down Nonnezoshe Boco, and the only changes were that the walls of the lower gorge heightened and merged into those above, and that these upper ones towered even loftier. Shefford had to throw his head straight back to look up at the rims, and the narrow strip of sky was now indeed a flowing stream of blue. Difficult steps were met, too, yet nothing compared to those of the upper cañon. Shefford calculated that this day's travel had advanced several hours, and more than ever now he was anticipating the mouth of Nonnezoshe Boco. Still another hour went by, and then came striking changes. The cañon narrowed till the walls were scarcely 20 paces apart. The color of stone grew dark red above and black down low. The light of day became shadowed, and the floor was a level, gravelly, winding lane, with the stream meandering slowly and silently. Suddenly the Indian halted. He turned his ear down the cañon lane. He had heard something. The others grouped round him, but did not hear a sound except the soft flow of water and the heave of the mustangs. Then the Indian went on. Presently he halted again, and again he listened. This time he threw up his head, and upon his dark face shone a light which might have been pride. "Se ko en se igi," he said. The others could not understand, but they were impressed. "Sure he means something big," drawled Lassiter. "Oh, what did he say?" queried Fay in eagerness. "Nas Ta Bega tells us," said Shefford. "We are full of hope." "Grand Cañon," replied the Indian. "How do you know?" asked Shefford. "I hear the roar of the river." But Shefford, listen as he might, could not hear it. They traveled on, winding down the wonderful lane. Every once in a while Shefford lagged behind, let the others pass out of hearing, and then he listened. At last he was rewarded. Low and deep, dull and strange, with some quality to incite dread, came a roar. Thereafter, at intervals, usually at turns in the cañon, and when a faint stir of warm air fanned his cheeks, he heard the sound, growing clearer and louder. He rounded an abrupt corner to have the roar suddenly fill his ears, to see the lane extend straight to a ragged vent, and beyond that, at some distance, a dark, ragged, bulging wall like iron. As he hurried forward, he was surprised to find that the noise did not increase. Here it kept a strange uniformity of tone and volume. The others of the party passed out of the mouth of Nonnezoshe Boco in advance of Shefford, and when he reached it, they were grouped upon a bank of sand. A dark red cañon yawned before them, and through it slid the strangest river Shefford had ever seen. At first glance he imagined the strangeness consisted of the dark red color of the water, but at the second he was not so sure. All the others, except Nas Ta Bega, eyed the river blankly, as if they did not know what to think. The roar came from round a huge, bulging wall downstream. Up the cañon, half a mile, at another turn, there was a leaping rapid of dirty red-white waves, and the sound of this, probably, was drowned in the unseen but nearer rapid. "This is the Grand Cañon of the Colorado," said Shefford. "We've come out at the mouth of Nonnezoshe Boco, and now to wait for Joe Lake." They made camp on a dry, level sandbar under a shelving wall. Nas Ta Bega collected a pile of driftwood to be used for fire, and then he took the mustangs back up the side cañon to find grass for them. Lassiter appeared unusually quiet, and soon passed from weary rest on the sand to deep slumber. Fay and Jane succumbed to an exhaustion that manifested itself the moment relaxation set in, and they, too, fell asleep. Shefford patrolled the long strip of sand under the wall and watched up the river for Joe Lake. The Indian returned and went along the river, climbed over the jutting, sharp slopes that reached into the water, and passed out of sight upstream toward the rapid. Shefford had a sense that the river and the cañon were too magnificent to be compared with others. Still, all his emotions and sensations had been so wrought upon that he seemed not to have any left by which he might judge of what constituted the difference. He would wait. He had a grim conviction that, before he was safely out of this earth-riven crack, he would know. One thing, however, struck him, and it was that up the cañon, high over the lower walls, hazy and blue, stood other walls, and beyond and above them, dim in purple distance, upreared still other walls. The haze and the blue and the purple meant great distance, and likewise the height seemed incomparable. The Red River attracted him most, since this was the medium by which he must escape with this party. It was natural that it absorbed him to the neglect of the gigantic cliffs. And the more he watched the river, studied it, listened to it, imagined its nature, its power, its restlessness, the more he dreaded it. As the hours of the afternoon wore away, and he strolled along and rested on the banks, his first impressions, and what he realized might be his truest ones, were gradually lost. He could not bring them back. The river was changing, deceitful. It worked upon his mind. The low, hollow roar filled his ears and seemed to mock him. Then he endeavored to stop thinking about it, to confine his attention to the gap upstream, where sooner or later he prayed that Joe Lake and his boat would appear. But though he controlled his gaze, he could not his thoughts, and his strange, impondering dread of the river augmented. The afternoon waned. Nas Ta Bega came back to camp and said any likelihood of Joe's arrival was past for that day. Shefford could not get over an impression of strangeness, of the impossibility of the reality presented to his naked eyes. These lonely fugitives in the huge walled cañon, waiting for a boatman to come down that river. Strange and wild, those were the words which, inadequately at best, suited this country and the situations it produced. After supper he and Fay walked along the bars of smooth red sand. There were a few moments when the distant peaks and domes and turrets were glorified in changing sunset hues, but the beauty was fleeting. Fay still showed lassitude. She was quiet yet cheerful, and the sweetness of her smile, her absolute trust in him, stirred and strengthened anew his spirit. Yet he suffered torture when he thought of trusting Fay's life, her soul, and her beauty to the strange Red River. Night brought him relief. He could not see the river. Only the low roar made its presence known out there in the shadows. And, there being no need to stay awake, he dropped at once into heavy slumber. He was roused by hands dragging at him. Nas Ta Bega bent over him. It was broad daylight. The yellow wall high above was glistening. A fire was crackling, and pleasant odors were wafted to him. Fay and Jane and Lassiter sat around the tarpaulin at breakfast. After the meal, suspense and strain were manifested in all the fugitives, even the imperturbable Indian being more than usually watchful. His eyes scarcely left the black gap where the river slid round the turn above. Soon, as on the preceding day, he disappeared up the ragged, iron-bound shore. There was scarcely an attempt at conversation. A controlling thought bound that group into silence. If Joe Lake was ever going to come, he would come today. Shefford asked himself 100 times if it were possible, and his answer seemed to be in the low, sullen, muffled roar of the river. As the morning wore on toward noon, his dread deepened until all chance appeared hopeless. Already he had begun to have vague and unformed and disquieting ideas of the only avenue of escape left, to return up Nonnezoshe Boco, and that would be to enter a trap. Suddenly a piercing cry pealed down the cañon. It was followed by echoes, weird and strange, that clapped from wall to wall in mocking concatenation. Nas Ta Bega appeared high on the ragged slope. The cry had been the Indian's. He swept an arm out, pointing upstream, and stood like a statue on the iron rocks. Shefford's keen gaze sighted a moving something in the bend of the river. It was long, low, dark, and flat, with a lighter object upright in the middle, a boat and a man. "Joe! It's Joe!" yelled Shefford madly. "There! Look!" Jane and Fay were on their knees in the sand, clasping each other, pale faces, toward that bend in the river. Shefford ran up the shore toward the Indian. He climbed the jutting slant of rock. The boat was now full in the turn. It moved faster. It was nearing the smooth incline above the rapid. There it glided down, heaved darkly up, settled back, and disappeared in the frothy, muddy roughness of water. Shefford held his breath and watched. A dark, bobbing object showed, vanished, showed again to enlarge, to take the shape of a big flatboat, and then it rode the swift, choppy current out of the lower end of the rapid. Nas Ta Bega began to make violent motions, and Shefford, taking his cue, frantically waved his red scarf. There was a 5-mile-an-hour current right before them, and Joe must needs see them so that he might sheer the huge and clumsy craft into the shore before it drifted too far down. Presently Joe did see them. He appeared to be half naked. He raised aloft both arms and bellowed down the cañon. The echoes boomed from wall to wall, every one stronger, with a deep, hoarse triumph in the Mormon's voice, till they passed on, growing weaker, to die away in the roar of the river below. Then Joe bent to a long oar that appeared to be fastened to the stern of the boat, and the craft drifted out of the swifter current toward the shore. It reached the point opposite to where Shefford and the Indian waited, and though Joe made prodigious efforts, it slid on. Still, it also drifted shoreward, and halfway down to the mouth of Nonnezoshe Boco, Joe threw the end of a rope to the Indian. "Ho, ho!" yelled the Mormon, again setting into motion the fiendish echoes. He was naked to the waist. He had lost flesh. He was haggard, worn, dirty, wet. While he pulled on his shirt, Nas Ta Bega made the rope fast to a snag of a log of driftwood embedded in the sand, and the boat swung to shore. It was perhaps 30 feet long by half as many wide, crudely built of rough-hewn boards. The steering gear was a long pole with a plank nailed to the end. The craft was empty, save for another pole and plank, Joe's coat, and a broken-handled shovel. There were water and sand on the flooring. Joe stepped ashore, and he was gripped first by Shefford and then by the Indian. He was an unkempt and gaunt giant, yet how steadfast and reliable, how grimly strong to inspire hope. "Reckon most of me's here," he said in reply to greetings. "I've had water aplenty. My God, I've had water! He rolled out a grim laugh. "But no grub for 3 days. Forgot to fetch some." How practical he was! He told Fay she looked good for sore eyes, but he needed a biscuit most of all. There was just a second of singular hesitation when he faced Lassiter, and then the big, strong hand of the young Mormon went out to meet the old gunman's. While they fed him and he ate like a starved man, Shefford told of the flight from the village, the rescuing of Jane and Lassiter from Surprise Valley, the descent from the plateau, the catastrophe to Shadd's gang, and concluding, Shefford, without any explanation, told that Nas Ta Bega had killed the Mormon wagoner. "Reckon I had that figured," replied Joe. "First off, I didn't think so. So Shadd went over the cliff. That's good riddance. It beats me, though. Never knew that Piute's like with a horse. And he had some grand horses in his outfit. Pity about them." Later, when Joe had a moment alone with Shefford, he explained that during his ride to Kayenta he had realized Fay's innocence, and who had been responsible for the tragedy. He took Withers the trader into his confidence, and they planned a story, which Withers was to carry to Stonebridge, that would exculpate Fay and Shefford of anything more serious than flight. If Shefford got Fay safely out of the country at once, that would end the matter for all concerned. "Reckon I'm some ferry boatman, too, a ferry boatman. Ha ha," he added. "And we're going through. Now, I want you to help me rig this tarpaulin up over the bow of the boat. If we can fix it up strong, it'll keep the waves from curling over. They filled her 4 times for me." They folded the tarpaulin 3 times, and with stout pieces of split plank and horseshoe nails from Shefford's saddlebags and pieces of rope, they rigged up a screen around bow and front corners. Nas Ta Bega put the saddles in the boat. The mustangs were far up Nonnezoshe Boco and would work their way back to green and luxuriant canyons. The Indians said they would soon become wild and would never be found. Shefford regretted Nack Yal, but was glad the faithful little mustang would be free in one of those beautiful canyons. "Reckon we'd better be off," called Joe. "All aboard." He placed Fay and Jane in the corner of the bow, where they would be spared sight of the rapids. Shefford loosed the rope and sprang aboard. "Pard," said Joe, "it's one hell of a river. And now, with the snow melting up in the mountains, it's 20 feet above normal and rising fast. But that's well for us. It covers the stones in the rapids. If it hadn't been in flood, Joe would be an angel now." End of chapter 19, part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2 of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, Part 2. The boat cleared the sand, lazily wheeled in the eddying water, and suddenly seemed caught by some powerful gliding force. When it swept out beyond the jutting wall, Shefford saw a 1/4 of a mile of sliding water that appeared to end abruptly. Beyond lengthened out the gigantic gap between the black and frowning cliffs. "Wow!" ejaculated Joe. "Drops out of sight there. But that one ain't much. I can tell by the roar. When you see my hair stand up straight, then watch out. Lassiter, you look after the women. Shefford, you stand ready to bail out with the shovel, for we'll sure ship water. Nas Ta Bega, you help me here with the oar." The roar became a heavy, continuous rumble. The current quickened. Little streaks and ridges seemed to race along the boat. Strange gurglings rose from under the bow. Shefford stood on tiptoe to see the break in the river below. Swiftly it came into sight. A wonderful, long, smooth, red slant of water, a swelling mound, a huge black curling wave, another and another, a sea of frothy, uplifting crests, leaping and tumbling and diminishing down to the narrowing apex of the rapid. It was a frightful sight, yet it thrilled Shefford. Joe worked the steering oar back and forth and headed the boat straight for the middle of the incline. The boat reached the round rim, gracefully dipped with a heavy sop, and went shooting down. The wind blew wet in Shefford's face. He stood erect, thrilling, fascinated, frightened. Then he seemed to feel himself lifted. The curling wave leaped at the boat. There was a shock that laid him flat, and when he rose to his knees, all about him was roar and spray and leaping muddy waves. Shock after shock jarred the boat. Splashes of water stung his face, and then the jar and the motion, the confusion and roar, gradually lessened until presently Shefford rose to see smooth water ahead and the long, trembling rapid behind. "Get busy, bailer," yelled Joe. "Pretty soon you'll be glad you have to bail, so you can't see." There were several inches of water in the bottom of the boat, and Shefford learned for the first time the expediency of a shovel in the art of bailing. "The tarpaulin worked powerful good," went on Joe, "and it saves the women. Now, if it just don't bust on a big wave. The one back there was little." When Shefford had scooped out all the water, he went forward to see how Fay and Jane and Lassiter had fared. The women were pale, but composed. They had covered their heads. "But the dreadful roar!" exclaimed Fay. Lassiter looked shaken for once. "Sure I'd rather take a chance meeting them Mormons on the way out," he said. Shefford spoke with an encouraging assurance which he did not himself feel. Almost at the moment he marked the silence that had fallen into the cañon. Then it broke to a low, dull, strange roar. "Ah, hear that?" The Mormon shook his shaggy head. "Reckon we're in Cataract Cañon. We'll be standing on end from now on. Hang on to her, boys." Danger of this unusual kind had brought out a peculiar levity in the somber Mormon, a kind of wild, gay excitement. His eyes rolled as he watched the river ahead, and he puffed out his cheek with his tongue. The rugged, overhanging walls of the cañon grew sinister in Shefford's sight. They were jaws, and the river that made him shudder to look down into it. The little whirling pits were eyes peering into his, and they raced on with the boat, disappeared, and came again, always with the little hollow gurgles. The craft drifted swiftly, and the roar increased. Another rapid seemed to move up into view. It came at a bend in the cañon. When the breeze struck Shefford's cheek, he did not this time experience exhilaration. The current accelerated its sliding motion and bore the flatboat straight for the middle of the curve. Shefford saw the bend, a long, dark, narrow, gloomy cañon, and a stretch of contending waters. Then, crouching low, he waited for the dip, the race, the shock. They came, the last stopping the boat, throwing it aloft, letting it drop, and crests of angry waves curled over the side. Shefford, kneeling, felt the water slap around him, and in his ears was a deafening roar. There were endless moments of strife and hell and flying darkness of spray all about him, and under him the rocking boat. When they lessened, ceased in violence, he stood ankle-deep in water, and then, madly, he began to bail. Another roar deadened his ears, but he did not look up from his toil, and when he had to get down to avoid the pitch, he closed his eyes. The rapid passed, and with more water to bail, he resumed his share in the manning of the crude craft. It was more than his share, a tremendous responsibility to which he bent with all his might. He heard Joe yell, and again and again. He heard the increasing roars of one after another, till they seemed one continuous bellow. He felt the shock, the pitch, the beating waves, and then the lessening power of sound and current. That set him to his task. Always, in these long intervals of toil, he seemed to see, without looking up, the growing proportions of the cañon. And the river had become a living, terrible thing. The intervals of his tireless effort when he scooped the water overboard were fleeting, and the rides through rapid after rapid were endless periods of waiting terror. His spirit and his hope were overwhelmed by the rush and roar and fury. Then, as he worked, there came a change, a rest to the deafened ears, a stretch of river that seemed quiet after chaos, and here for the first time he bailed the boat clear of water. Jane and Fay were huddled in a corner, with the flapping tarpaulin now half fallen over them. They were wet and muddy. Lassiter crouched like a man dazed by a bad dream, and his white hair hung, stained and bedraggled, over his face. The Indian and the Mormon, grim, hard, worn, stood silent at the oar. The afternoon was far advanced, and the sun had already descended below the western ramparts. A cool breeze blew up the cañon, laden with a sound that was the same, yet not the same, as those low, dull roars which Shefford dreaded more and more. Joe Lake turned his ear to the breeze. A strong puff brought a heavy, quivering rumble. This time he did not vent his gay and wild defiance to the river. He bent lower, listened. Then, as the rumble became a strange, deep, reverberating roll, as if the monstrous river were rolling huge stones down a subterranean cañon, Shefford saw with dilating eyes that the Mormon's hair was rising stiff upon his head. "Hear that?" said Joe, turning an ashen face to Shefford. "We'll drop off the earth now. Hang on to the girl, so if we go, you can go together. And, pard, if you've a God, pray." Nas Ta Bega faced the bend from whence the rumble came, and he was the same dark, inscrutable, impassive Indian as of old. What was death to him? Shefford felt the strong, rushing love of life surge in him, and it was not for himself, he thought, but for Fay and the happiness she merited. He went to her, patted the covered head, and tried with words choking in his throat to give hope. And he leaned with hands gripping the gunwale, with eyes wide open, ready for the unknown. The river made a quick turn, and from round the bend rumbled a terrible uproar. The current racing that way was divided or uncertain, and it gave strange motion to the boat. Joe and Nas Ta Bega shoved desperately upon the oar, all to no purpose. The currents had their will. The bow of the boat took the place of the stern. Then, swift at the head of a curved incline, it shot beyond the bulging wall. And Shefford saw an awful place before them. The cañon had narrowed to half its width and turned almost at right angles. The huge clamor of appalling sound came from under the cliff where the swollen river had to pass, and where there was not space. The rapid rushed with gigantic swells right upon the wall, boomed against it, climbed and spread and fell away to recede and gather new impetus, to leap madly on down the cañon. Shefford went to his knees, clasped Fay and Jane too. But facing this appalling thing, he had to look. Courage and despair came to him at the last. This must be the end. With long, buoyant swing, the boat sailed down, shot over the first waves, was caught, and lifted upon the great swell, and impelled straight toward the cliff. Huge whirlpools raced alongside, and from them came a horrible, engulfing roar. Monstrous bulges rose on the other side. All the stupendous power of that mighty river of downward rushing silt swung the boat aloft, up and up, as the swell climbed the wall. Shefford, with transfixed eyes and harrowed soul, watched the wet black wall. It loomed down upon him. The stern of the boat went high. Then, when the crash that meant doom seemed imminent, the swell spread and fell back from the wall, and the boat never struck at all. By some miraculous chance it had been favored by a strange and momentary receding of the huge spent swell. Then it slid back and caught and whirled by the current into a red, frothy, upflung rapids below. Shefford bowed his head over Fay and saw no more, nor felt nor heard. What seemed a long time after that, the broken voice of the Mormon recalled him to his labors. The boat was half full of water. Nas Ta Bega scooped out great sheets of it with his hands. Shefford sprang to aid him, found the shovel, and plunged into the task. Slowly but surely they emptied the boat, and then Shefford saw that twilight had fallen. Joe was working the craft toward a narrow bank of sand, to which presently they came, and the Indian sprang out to moor to a rock. The fugitives went ashore, and, weary and silent and drenched, they dropped in the warm sand. But Shefford could not sleep. The river kept him awake. In the distance it rumbled, low, deep, reverberating, and near at hand it was a thing of mutable mood. It moaned, whined, mocked, and laughed. It had the soul of a devil. It was a river that had cut its way to the bowels of the earth, and its nature was destructive. It harbored no life. Fighting its way through those dead walls, cutting and tearing and wearing, its heavy burden of silt was death, destruction, and decay. A silent river, a murmuring, strange, fierce, terrible, thundering river of the desert. Even in the dark it seemed to wear the hue of blood. All night long Shefford heard it, and toward the dark hours before dawn, when a restless, broken sleep came to him, his dreams were dreams of a river of sounds. All the beautiful sounds he knew and loved he heard, the sigh of the wind in the pines, the mourn of the wolf, the cry of the laughing gull, the murmur of running brooks, the song of a child, the whisper of a woman. And there was the boom of the surf, the roar of the north wind in the forest, the roll of thunder. And there were the sounds, not of earth, a river of the universe rolling the planets, engulfing the stars, pouring the sea of blue into infinite space. Night with its fitful dreams passed. Dawn lifted the ebony gloom out of the cañon, and sunlight far up on the ramparts renewed Shefford's spirit. He rose and awoke the others. Fay's wistful smile still held its faith. They ate of the gritty, water-soaked food. Then they embarked. The current carried them swiftly down and out of hearing of the last rapid. The character of the river and the cañon changed. The current lessened to a slow, smooth, silent, eddying flow. The walls grew straight, sheer, gloomy, and vast. Shefford noted these features, but he was listening so hard for the roar of the next rapid that he scarcely appreciated them. All the fugitives were listening. Every bend in the cañon, and now the turns were numerous, might hold a rapid. Shefford strained his ears. He imagined the low, dull, strange rumble. He had it in his ears, yet there was the growing sensation of silence. "Sure this is a dead place," muttered Lassiter. "She's only slowed up for a bigger plunge," replied Joe. "Listen, hear that?" But there was no true sound. Joe only imagined what he expected and hated and dreaded to hear. Mile after mile they drifted through the silent gloom between those vast and magnificent walls. After the speed, the turmoil, the whirling, shrieking, thundering, the never-ceasing sound and change and motion of the rapids above, This slow, quiet drifting, this utter, absolute silence, these eddying stretches of still water below worked strangely upon Shefford's mind, and he feared he was going mad. There was no change to the silence, no help for the slow drift, no lessening of the strain, and the hours of the day passed as moments. The sun crossed the blue gap above. The golden lights hung upon the upper walls. The gloom returned, and still there was only dead, vast, insupportable silence. There came bends where the current quickened, ripples widened, long lanes of little waves roughened the surface, but they made no sound. And then the fugitives turned through a V-shaped vent in the cañon. The ponderous walls sheered away from the river. There was a space and sunshine, and far beyond this league-wide open rose vermilion-colored cliffs. A mile below the river disappeared in a dark, box-like passage from which came a rumble that made Shefford's flesh creep. The Mormon flung high his arms and let out that stentorian yell that had rolled down to the fugitives as they waited at the mouth of Nonnezoshe Boco, but now it had a wilder, more exultant note. Strange how he shifted his gaze to Fay Larkin. "Girl, get up and look," he called. "The ferry! The ferry!" Then he bent his brawny back over the steering oar, and the clumsy craft slowly turned toward the left-hand shore, where a long, low bank of green willows and cottonwoods gave welcome relief to the eye. Upon the opposite side of the river Shefford saw a boat, similar to the one he was in, moored to the bank. "Sure if I ain't losing my eyes, I see an Indian with a red blanket," said Lassiter. "Yes, Lassiter," cried Shefford. "Look, Fay. Look, Jane. See? Indians. Hogans. Mustangs. There above the green bank." The boat glided slowly shoreward, and the deep, hungry, terrible rumble of the Chapter 20 of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Willow Springs. 2 days' travel time from the river, along the saw-toothed range of Echo Cliffs, stood Presby's trading post, a little red stone square house in a green and pretty valley called Willow Springs. It was nearing the time of sunset, that gorgeous hour of color in the painted desert, when Shefford and his party rode down upon the post. The scene lacked the wildness characteristic of Kayenta or Red Lake. There were wagons and teams, white men and Indians, burros, sheep, lambs, mustangs saddled and unsaddled, dogs and chickens. A young, sweet-faced woman stood in the door of the post, and she it was who first sighted the fugitives. Presby was weighing bags of wool on a scale, and when she called he lazily turned, as if to wonder at her eagerness. Then he flung up his head with its shock of heavy hair in a start of surprise, and his florid face lost its lazy insolence to become wreathed in a huge smile. "Haven't seen a white person in 6 months," was his extraordinary greeting. An hour later, Shefford, clean-shaven, comfortably clothed once more, found himself a different man. And when he saw Fay in white again, with a new and indefinable light shining through that old haunting shadow in her eyes, then the world changed, and he embraced perfect happiness. There was a dinner, such as Shefford had not seen for many a day, and such as Fay had never seen, and that brought to Jane Withersteen's eyes the dreamy memory of the bountiful feasts which, long years ago, had been her pride. And there was a story told to the curious trader and his kind wife, a story with its beginning back in those past years, of riders of the purple sage, of Fay Larkin as a child, and then as a wild girl in Surprise Valley, of the flight down Nonnezoshe Boco, and the cañon of a great Mormon and a noble Indian. Presby stared with his deep-set eyes, and wagged his tousled head, and stared again. Then, with a quick perception of the practical desert man, he said, "I'm sending teamsters into Flagstaff tomorrow. Wife and I will go along with you. We've light wagons. 3 days, maybe, or 4, and we'll be there. Shefford, I'm going to see you marry Fay Larkin." Fay and Jane and Lassiter showed strangely against this background of approaching civilization, and Shefford realized more than ever the loneliness and isolation and wildness of so many years for them. When the women had retired, Shefford and the men talked a while. Then Joe Lake rose to stretch his big frame. "Friends, reckon I'm all in," he said. "Good night." In passing, he laid a heavy hand on Shefford's shoulder. "Well, you got out. I've only a queer notion how, but someone beside an Indian and a Mormon guided you out. Be good to the girl. Good-bye, pard." Shefford grasped the big hand, and in the emotion of the moment did not catch the significance of Joe's last words. Later Shefford stepped outside into the starlight for a few moments' quiet walk, and thought before he went to bed. It was a white night. The coyotes were yelping. The stars shone steadfast, bright, cold. Nas Ta Bega stalked out of the shadow of the house and joined Shefford. They walked in silence. Shefford's heart was too full for utterance, and the Indian seldom spoke at any time. When Shefford was ready to go in, Nas Ta Bega extended his hand. "Good-bye, Bi Nai," he said, strangely, using English and Navajo in what Shefford supposed to be merely good night. The starlight shone full upon the dark, inscrutable face of the Indian. Shefford bade him good night, and then watched him stride away in the silvery gloom. But next morning Shefford understood. Nas Ta Bega and Joe Lake were gone. It was a shock to Shefford, yet what could he have said to either? Joe had shirked saying good-bye to him and Fay, and the Indian had gone out of Shefford's life as he had come into it. What these two men represented in Shefford's uplift was too great for the present to define, but they and the desert that had developed them had taught him the meaning of life. He might fail often, since failure was the lot of his kind, but could he ever fail again in faith in man or God, while he had mind to remember the Indian and the Mormon? Still, though he placed them on a noble height and loved them well, there would always abide with him a sorrow for the Mormon and a sleepless and eternal regret for that Indian on his lonely cedar slope, with the spirits of his vanishing race calling him. Willow Springs appeared to be a lively place that morning. Presby was gay, and his sweet-faced wife was excited. The teamsters were a jolly, whistling lot, and the lean mustangs kicked and bit at one another. The trader had brought out 2 light wagons for the trip, and, after the manner of desert men, desired to start at sunrise. From across the painted desert towered the San Francisco peaks, black-timbered, blue-canyoned, purple-hazed, with white snow like the clouds around their summits. Jane Withersteen looked at the radiant Fay and lived again in her happiness, and at last excitement had been communicated to the old gunman. "Sure we're going to live with Fay and John, and be near Venters and Bess, and see the blacks again, Jane, and Venters will tell you, as he did me, how Wrangle run Black Star off his legs." All connected with that early start was sweet, sad, hopeful. And so they rode away from Willow Springs, through the green fields of alfalfa and cottonwood, down the valley with its smoking hogans and whistling mustangs and scarlet-blanketed Indians, and out upon the bay Epilogue of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On the outskirts of a little town in Illinois, there was a farm of rolling pasture land, and here a beautiful meadow, green and red in clover, merged upon an orchard in the midst of which a brown tiled roof showed above the trees. One afternoon in May a group of people, strangely agitated, walked down a shady lane toward the meadow. "Well, Jane, I always knew we'd get a look at them horses again. I sure knew," Lassiter was saying, in the same old, cool, careless drawl. But his claw-like hands shook a little. "Oh, will they know me?" asked Jane Withersteen, turning to a stalwart man, no other than the dark-faced Ventnors, her rider of other days. "Know you? I'll bet they will," replied Ventnors. "What do you say, Bess?" The shadow brightened in Bess's somber blue eyes, as if his words had recalled her from a sad and memorable past. "Black Star will know her surely," replied Bess. "Sometimes he points his nose toward the west and watches, as if he saw the purple slopes and smelt the sage of Utah. He has never forgotten. But night has grown deaf and partly blind of late. I doubt if he'd remember." Shefford and Fay walked arm in arm in the background. Out in the meadow 2 horses were grazing. They were sleek, shiny, long-maned, long-tailed, black as coal, and though old, still splendid in every line. "Do you remember them?" whispered Shefford. "Oh, I only needed to see Black Star," murmured Fay, her voice quivering. "I can remember being lifted on his back. How strange! It seems so long ago. Look, Mother Jane is going out to them." Jane Withersteen advanced alone through the clover, and it was with unsteady steps. Presently she halted. What glorious and bitter memories were expressed in her strange, poignant call! Black Star started and swept up his noble head and looked, but night went on calmly grazing. Then Jane called again, the same strange call, only louder, and this time broken. Black Star raised his head higher, and he whistled a piercing blast. He saw Jane, he knew her, as he had remembered the call, and he came pounding toward her. She met him, encircled his neck with her arms, and buried her face in his mane. "Sure, I reckon I'd better never say any more about Wrangle running the blacks off their legs that time," muttered Lassiter, as if to himself. "Lassiter, you only dreamed that race," replied Venters, with a smile. "Oh, Bern, isn't it good to see that Black Star remembered her? That she'll have him, something left of her old home?" asked Bess wistfully. "Indeed it is good. But, Bess, Jane Withersteen will find a new spirit and new happiness here." Jane came toward them, leading both horses. "Dear friends, I am happy. Today I bury all regrets. Of the past I shall remember only my riders of the purple sage." Venters smiled his gladness. "And you, Lassiter, what shall you remember?" he queried. The old gunman looked at Jane, and then at his claw-like hands, and then at Fay. His eyes lost their shadow and began to twinkle. "Well, I rolled a stone once, but I reckon now that time Wrangle—" "Lassiter, I said you dreamed that race. Wrangle never beat the blacks," interrupted Venters. "And you, Fay, what shall you remember?" "Surprise Valley," replied Fay, dreamily. "And you, Shefford?" Shefford shook his head. For him there could never be one memory only. In his heart there would never change or die memories of the wild uplands, of the great towers and walls, of the golden sunsets on the cañon ramparts, of the silent, fragrant valleys where the cedars and the sago lilies grew, of those starlit nights when his love and faith awoke, of grand and lonely Nonnezoshe, of that red, sullen, thunderous, mysterious Colorado River, of a wonderful Indian and a noble Mormon, and of all that was embodied for him in the meaning of the Rainbow Trail. End of the Epilogue.